Commander Vexqui had delivered the same mandatory safety briefing approximately 893 times during their tenure at the Galactic Academy, and each time the reaction was identical. 200 alien cadets transforming into various states of existential dread at the mere mention of certain words. Today would be no different, or so Vexqui assumed as they activated the holographic display with practiced efficiency. All 6 chitinous blue arms moving in perfect synchronization like some kind of cosmic conductor, orchestrating a symphony of bureaucratic terror. Class 9 Alpha threats, Vexqui announced, their chitinous blue carapace gleaming under the auditorium's artificial lighting. Predator cubs. A collective shudder rippled through the audience. Tentacles recoiled, crystalline appendages dimmed, and somewhere in the back, a Voltarian cadet made a sound that could only be described as a whimper filtered through a synthesizer. Lieutenant Jake Mitchell, wedged uncomfortably between 2 particularly nervous Centaurians, couldn't help but notice that his fellow students were reacting to predator cubs the way most humans might react to weaponized plague zombies. He shifted in his seat, designed naturally for beings with entirely different anatomical configurations, and wondered, not for the first time, if his recruitment officer had been entirely honest about this cultural exchange program. "Observe," Vexqui continued, their voice carrying the weight of someone who had clearly seen some serious galactic nonsense in their time. "The typical predator cub in its natural habitat." The hologram shimmered into focus, displaying what Jake could only describe as, well, a puppy. A slightly alien puppy with too many eyes and fur that seemed to shift colors, but unmistakably a baby something or other that probably just wanted belly rubs and maybe a chew toy. The auditorium erupted into gasps of horror. "Note the telltale signs," Vexqui gestured with 2 arms, while the other 4 highlighted various features on the display. Forward-facing eyes, the mark of a hunter, developing claws, instruments of death, and most terrifying of all, the instinctual play behavior that teaches them to kill. Jake watched in fascination as his fellow cadets took frantic notes about what he was pretty sure was just a cosmic golden retriever having a good time. The creature in the hologram was rolling around, chasing its own tail, and occasionally pouncing on what looked like space flowers. "The Academy's official stance," Vexqui continued with the solemnity usually reserved for funeral orations, "is complete avoidance of any system containing predator species during their reproductive cycles. The cubs may appear diminutive, but make no mistake, they are killers in training." A Centaurian near Jake raised a trembling, crystalline hand. "Commander, what if we encounter predator cubs accidentally?" "Protocol Omega-9, Vexqui replied without hesitation. "Immediate evacuation, full defensive screens, and under no circumstances should anyone attempt to interact with the creatures. Their cuteness is merely evolutionary camouflage designed to lower the guard of potential prey." Jake couldn't contain himself anymore. The words slipped out before his diplomatic training could stop them. "Stronger than wolves?" The auditorium fell silent. 200 pairs of eyes, some compound, some crystalline, some that defied geometric explanation, turned to stare at the lone human in their midst. Jake felt like a vegetarian who had just wandered into a barbecue convention wearing a "Meat is Murder" t-shirt. "I beg your pardon?" Vexqui's voice carried the tone of someone who wasn't entirely sure they had heard correctly. Jake cleared his throat, acutely aware that he had somehow committed a social blunder of spectacular proportions. Well, you said predator cubs, and I was wondering if they were stronger than, say, wolf cubs back on my world." The silence stretched on like a bad holodrama, Someone in the front row whispered something that sounded like a prayer in Altarian. Jake's centaurian neighbor, Kulixnav, had turned such a pale shade of crystal that Jake worried he might actually be witnessing some kind of medical emergency. "You ... Vexqui began, then stopped, all 6 arms freezing mid-gesture. "You have predators on your homeworld?" "Well, yeah," Jake said, wondering why this was apparently such shocking news. "I mean, we've got wolves, bears, big cats, sharks. The usual planetary ecosystem stuff." Another collective gasp swept through the auditorium. Jake was starting to feel like he was inadvertently confessing to war crimes. "And you coexist with these creatures?" The question came from Administrator Fluxdem, who had apparently materialized at the back of the auditorium like some kind of bureaucratic nightmare. His species, Jake could never remember the proper pronunciation, something with too many apostrophes, had evolved from what could generously be described as nervous herbivores, and it showed in every quivering antenna. "Coexist might be a strong word," Jake replied, trying to inject some levity into what had become an unexpectedly tense situation. "We mostly just try not to annoy them. Though some people keep dogs as pets, and they're basically domesticated wolves, so—" The sound that erupted from the assembled aliens could only be described as 200 beings simultaneously having existential crises. Jake watched in amazement as several cadets actually fainted, their various forms of consciousness apparently unable to process the concept of voluntarily sharing living space with predators. Vexqui's compound eyes fixed on Jake with an intensity that made him suddenly understand why prey animals evolved to run very, very fast. "Lieutenant Mitchell," they said, their voice carrying a strange mixture of fascination and absolute terror. "Perhaps you would be so kind as to remain after class for a more detailed discussion of your unique perspective on predator behavior." Jake nodded, though he was beginning to suspect that his cultural exchange experience was about to become significantly more complicated than advertised. Around him, the other cadets were slowly recovering from their collective shock, though he noticed several had moved their seats noticeably farther away from him. As Vexiki resumed the briefing, now with considerably more nervous energy and frequent glances in Jake's direction, Jake couldn't help but wonder what exactly he had gotten himself into. The recruitment materials had mentioned expanding human understanding of galactic civilization and building bridges between species, but nobody had bothered to mention that humanity might be considered the galactic equivalent of a horror movie monster. The holographic display shifted to show various predator-cub warning signs, which Jake recognized as basic animal behaviors that any decent pet owner would find utterly normal. But watching his fellow students react with the kind of terror usually reserved for natural disasters, he began to understand that his perspective on the universe might be just a tiny bit different from everyone else's. And as Vexequi launched into a detailed explanation of predator-pack dynamics, which sounded suspiciously like a nature documentary about family structures, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to learn something very interesting about humanity's place in the galaxy. Something that his recruitment officer had definitely, absolutely, 100% forgotten to mention in the paperwork. 3 months earlier, Jake Mitchell had stepped off the transport shuttle onto Nexus Prime with the kind of optimistic enthusiasm that only comes from believing recruitment brochures. The Academy's orientation materials had painted a picture of exciting cross-cultural learning, advanced xenobiology studies, and the chance to represent humanity among the stars. What they had failed to mention, in what Jake was beginning to suspect was a deliberate oversight, was that humanity's reputation in the galaxy was somewhat more complicated than friendly neighborhood species looking to make new friends. His first clue should have been the quarantine protocols. Standard procedure, the processing officer had assured him, speaking through a full environmental suit while maintaining a distance that suggested Jake might spontaneously combust. All new species require a 96-hour observation period. Jake had spent those 96 hours in what could generously be called a luxury containment facility, and what he privately referred to as the galaxy's most expensive prison cell. The walls were lined with sensors that monitored everything from his heart rate to his digestive processes, while cameras tracked his every movement with the dedication of a nature documentary crew following a particularly dangerous predator. The real culture shock, however, had come when he met his assigned roommate. Kulixanav was a centaurian, which meant he looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a chandelier, and then taught the result to worry about absolutely everything. His crystalline skin shifted through various shades of anxiety-induced color changes, and Jake had quickly learned that pale blue meant concerned, deep purple indicated moderately terrified, and the rare flash of bright red suggested contemplating immediate evacuation to another galaxy. "You sleep with your eyes closed," Kulixanav had observed on their first night together, his voice carrying the tone of someone discovering a particularly disturbing alien custom. "Most humans do," Jake had replied, not seeing the problem. "But how do you watch for threats?" Jake had propped himself up on his elbow, studying his roommate's genuinely confused expression. "What threats?" "We're in a secure academy dormitory on a space station." The crystalline being had turned a shade of purple that Jake was learning to associate with deep existential crisis. "You truly have no predator awareness protocols?" And that, Jake reflected 3 months later, as he sat in Vexiki's briefing, listening to his fellow students react to holographic puppies like they were witnessing the opening scenes of a horror movie, had been his introduction to the galaxy's most fundamental truth. Most sentient species had evolved from prey animals, and it showed. The Academy's training modules had been a constant source of bewilderment. Jake had watched in amazement as highly trained military cadets cowered behind energy shields while observing holographic recordings of what appeared to be alien house cats. The creatures were admittedly larger than Earth felines, roughly the size of small ponies, but their behavior was unmistakably feline. They knocked things off surfaces for no apparent reason, ignored their supposed prey in favor of napping in inconvenient locations, and spent considerable time grooming themselves with an air of supreme indifference to everything around them. "Class 5 Beta Predators," the instructor had announced solemnly. "Note the casual disregard for potential threats, a clear indication of supreme confidence in their killing ability." Jake had raised his hand. "Are you sure they're not just cats?" The resulting silence had been so profound that Jake could hear the station's life support systems humming in the background. "Cats?" The instructor had repeated the word like Jake had just suggested they were actually sentient furniture. "You know," Jake had continued, digging himself deeper into what was apparently another cultural minefield. "Small domestic predators that humans keep as companions. They knock things over, sleep a lot, occasionally bring you dead things as presents." The sound of 24 alien cadets simultaneously hyperventilating had prompted the instructor to call an early end to that particular session, but it was the discovery of his own species' classification that had really driven home just how different his perspective was from everyone else's. "Humans," Administrator Fluxstem had informed him during what was ostensibly a routine check-in meeting, "are listed as Apex Alpha Predators in the Academy's Threat Assessment Database." Jake had laughed. Actually laughed. which, judging by Fluxdem's reaction, was apparently not the appropriate response to learning that your species was considered a galactic horror story. "That's ridiculous," Jake had said, still chuckling. "We're omnivores. We eat vegetables. Some of us are vegetarians. We keep pets and form cooperative societies and build art museums." "You also," Fluxdem had replied, consulting his datapad with the air of someone reading a particularly disturbing police report, "evolved from persistence hunters, maintain forward-facing eyes, possess canine teeth designed for tearing flesh, and have a documented history of domesticating other predator species for the purpose of hunting." "Well, when you put it like that, which is why," Fluxdem had continued, "Academy regulations require that human students be restricted from certain field exercises involving what we classify as sensitive species encounters." And there it was. Jake had come to the Academy expecting to study alien biology, and instead discovered that he was the alien biology everyone else was studying. His presence in classes wasn't about cultural exchange, it was about understanding how predator minds worked, like having a tame lion in a veterinary school to help students understand feline behavior. The realization had been both humbling and oddly amusing. Every nervous glance from his classmates, every wide berth given in corridors, every concerned whisper when he mentioned enjoying a good steak, it all made sense now. He wasn't Lieutenant Jake Mitchell, aspiring xenobiologist. He was Jake Mitchell, friendly neighborhood apex predator, trying very hard not to accidentally terrify anyone. The irony wasn't lost on him that his recruitment had probably been motivated by the Academy's desire to better understand predator psychology, while his own motivation had been to better understand alien psychology. They were studying each other, like some kind of mutual anthropological experiment wrapped in bureaucracy and seasoned with the kind of cross-species misunderstanding that probably spawned entire diplomatic incidents. Kulixinav had eventually warmed up to him, though warmed up was relative when dealing with someone whose default emotional state was mildly panicked. Their conversations had become exercises in translation, not just between languages, but between entirely different ways of perceiving the universe. "Do you ever feel unsafe?" Kulixinav had asked one evening as they studied together in their shared quarters. "Sometimes," Jake had admitted, "when I'm doing something genuinely dangerous, or if I'm in an unfamiliar situation with unclear risks." "But not constantly?" Jake had looked up from his xenobiology texts to find his roommate regarding him with something approaching wonder. "Should I?" "Most of us do," Kulixinav had said quietly. "It's normal. Background awareness of potential threats. Scanning for exits. Listening for unusual sounds. Evaluating everyone around us for possible danger signs." And that, Jake realized, was the fundamental difference. Prey species had evolved in a universe where vigilance meant survival, where letting your guard down for even a moment could mean death. Predator species had evolved in a universe where they were the thing other creatures needed to be vigilant about. No wonder his casual questions about wolves had caused such a stir in the briefing. To his fellow students, he had essentially announced that his home planet was populated by the stuff of nightmares, and that humans not only coexisted with these horrors, but actually kept some of them as pets. The truly amusing part was that Jake was beginning to understand he represented humanity's gentle academic side. If the Academy's cadets ever met a human soldier, or a hunter, or anyone who had actually embraced their species' predatory heritage, the resulting panic might require its own classification in the threat assessment database. As Vexqui's briefing continued around him, with increasingly nervous discussions of predator-pack dynamics and cub protection behaviors, Jake couldn't help but smile. He was learning about alien psychology after all, specifically how utterly terrifying they found him and everyone like him. And if that wasn't educational, he didn't know what was. The Academy's idea of a safe field exercise, Jake had learned, involved approximately the same level of preparation most militaries would dedicate to invading a small planet. The target destination was Luna Verdis III, a moon classified as Class C non-threatening wildlife, which in Academy terminology meant probably won't eat you, but we're bringing enough firepower to level a city just in case. Jake watched from the transport's observation deck as his fellow cadets conducted their pre-mission equipment checks with the methodical precision of beings who had clearly learned that inadequate preparation led to becoming something else's lunch. Energy shields, emergency beacons, full environmental suits, enough medical supplies to stock a small hospital, and weapons that looked like they could punch holes through battleship hulls. Standard protocol for any planetary surface mission, Klixanav explained, his crystalline form already encased in enough protective gear to survive a nuclear explosion. One can never be too careful when dealing with unknown ecosystems. Jake looked down at his own gear, a basic environmental suit, standard Academy field kit, and a handheld scanner. He felt somewhat underdressed for what everyone else was treating like a military operation, but then again, most of his fellow students would probably consider a nature hike through Central Park to be an extreme survival situation. "Remember," Vexequi announced over the transport's communication system, their voice carrying the weight of someone who had clearly seen enough field exercises go sideways to develop permanent trust issues. Luna Verdis III may be classified as non-threatening, but complacency kills. Maintain formation, follow established protocols, and under no circumstances should anyone approach any native wildlife without proper authorization and backup. The moon itself was actually quite beautiful. If you could ignore the fact that 23 heavily armed Academy cadets were treating it like a potential death trap. Rolling meadows stretched beneath alien skies, dotted with forests that looked suspiciously Earth-like, except for the trees that seemed to grow in mathematically impossible spirals. The air was clean, the gravity was comfortable, and the worst thing they had encountered in the first 2 hours was a butterfly analog that had caused a minor panic when it landed on a Voltarian cadet's sensor array. Jake was beginning to think the exercise would pass without incident when they heard the sounds. Soft mewing noises coming from a cluster of crystalline rock formations about 50 meters ahead. The kind of sounds that any reasonable person would immediately recognize as baby animals in some form of distress. The Academy cadets, naturally, reacted like they had stumbled across an active minefield. "Contact!" someone whispered into their comm system with the urgency usually reserved for announcing incoming enemy fire. Unidentified vocalizations bearing 27 Mark V. "All units, defensive positions," Vexequi commanded, their voice crackling through the comm with military precision. "Prepare for possible predator encounter." Jake watched in fascination as 23 highly trained individuals immediately formed what could only be described as a fortress of paranoia. Energy shields materialized, weapons powered up with ominous humming sounds, and everyone crouched behind whatever cover they could find, as if preparing for an assault by hostile alien forces. The mewing continued. "Sounds like juveniles," someone reported, their voice tight with barely controlled terror. "Possibly separated from their pack." "Predator cubs," another cadet whispered, the words carrying the kind of dread usually associated with announcing the end of the universe. Jake peered around the rock formation his classmates had designated as their primary defensive position and felt his brain perform what could only be described as a complete system reboot. The terrifying predator cubs were, without question, the most adorable things he had encountered since leaving Earth. They looked like golden retriever puppies that had been redesigned by someone with a particularly whimsical imagination. Soft, fluffy fur that shifted between gold and silver in the alien sunlight. Large, expressive eyes that held exactly the kind of innocent curiosity that evolution had apparently designed to make other creatures want to protect them. They were roughly the size of house cats, tumbling over each other in the universal language of young mammals being young mammals. And they were clearly lost, scared, and looking for their parents. "My sensors indicate at least 6 individuals," reported the cadet responsible for technical analysis, their voice shaking with what Jake was beginning to realize was genuine terror. "Estimated threat level, unknown. Recommend immediate withdrawal to minimum safe distance." "Agreed," Vexqui replied. "All units, prepare for tactical retreat. We cannot risk exposure to predator cubs without proper containment protocols." Jake blinked. Containment protocols? They're babies. The silence that followed his comment was so complete that Jake could hear the alien equivalent of crickets chirping in the distance. "Lieutenant Mitchell." Vexqui's voice carried the patience of someone explaining basic physics to a particularly slow student. "Those are predator offspring. They may appear diminutive, but their instinctual behaviors are designed for hunting and killing." Jake looked back at the deadly predator cubs, one of which had managed to get its head stuck in what appeared to be a hollow, crystalline formation, and was making frustrated noises while its siblings tried to help. Another had discovered its own tail and was chasing it in circles with the kind of intense concentration that suggested this was the most important task in the universe. "They're playing," Jake said, unable to keep the bewilderment out of his voice. "That's normal baby animal behavior. They're not hunting anything. They're just being kids." "Negative," came the immediate response from multiple sources. "Play behavior in predator species is practice for killing. Those games you observe are training exercises for future hunting activities." Jake watched one of the cubs attempt to pounce on a flower and miss spectacularly, tumbling head over heels in a way that would have been hilarious if everyone around him hadn't been treating it like a tactical military maneuver. "Look," he said, making what he knew was probably a mistake but unable to stop himself. "They're clearly lost and scared. Their parents are probably looking for them. This is exactly the kind of situation where the right approach could prevent any problems at all." "Lieutenant?" Fluxstem's voice crackled through the comm system, apparently monitoring the exercise from the safety of orbit. "Academy regulations strictly prohibit any interaction with predator species juveniles. The risk assessment protocols are quite clear on this matter." Jake looked around at his classmates, all of whom were crouched behind various forms of cover, armed to the teeth and ready for battle against what were essentially cosmic golden retriever puppies. The absurdity of the situation was almost overwhelming. "What if I—" he began. "No," came the immediate chorus from approximately everyone on the comm channel. But Jake had already made his decision. While his classmates huddled behind their defensive positions, he stood up, deactivated his helmet's external threat warnings, which had been beeping constantly since they spotted the cubs, and walked toward the cluster of rock formations. "Mitchell, get back here." Vexqui's voice carried the kind of authority that could probably stop a charging rhinoceros, but Jake had dealt with enough nervous animals in his life to know that sometimes the direct approach was the only approach that actually worked. The cubs noticed him immediately. 6 pairs of large, curious eyes turned in his direction, and Jake felt the familiar sensation of being evaluated by young animals trying to figure out whether he was friend, foe, or something interesting to investigate. He crouched down, making himself smaller and less threatening, and made the kind of soft, reassuring noises that worked on practically every baby mammal he had ever encountered. The cubs tilted their heads in unison, a gesture so perfectly puppy-like that Jake had to suppress a laugh. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice carrying the same tone he would use with nervous horses or scared dogs. "You guys lost?" One of the cubs, apparently the brave one of the group, took a tentative step forward. Its siblings huddled together, watching with the kind of intense curiosity that suggested they were waiting to see what would happen next. Jake extended his hand slowly, palm up, letting the cub catch his scent and decide whether he was worth investigating. The little creature approached cautiously, sniffed his glove with a nose that was definitely designed for tracking, and then did something that made Jake's heart melt and probably gave his watching classmates collective cardiac episodes. It licked his hand. "Oh, you are definitely somebody's babies," Jake murmured, gently scratching behind the cub's ears in the way that seemed to work on virtually every domesticated animal in existence. The cub made a soft, contented sound and leaned into the contact. His comm system erupted into chaos. "Mitchell is making physical contact with hostile predator juveniles. Repeat, we have a code red situation. Someone get the medic standing by. Should we prepare for emergency evacuation?" Jake ignored the commentary and focused on the cubs, who were gradually warming up to his presence. Within minutes, he had 6 baby space wolves tumbling around his feet, competing for attention and generally behaving like puppies everywhere throughout the galaxy. "They're not hostile," he reported calmly into his comm. "They're just kids who got separated from their pack. Probably wandered off while exploring and couldn't find their way back." "That's not possible," came Vexqui's voice, though Jake noticed it lacked some of its earlier certainty. "Predator species juveniles are inherently dangerous." "Not to other predators," Jake replied, the words slipping out before he could consider their implications. The comm channel fell silent. It was a silence that stretched long enough for Jake to realize he had just said something significant, something that his classmates were probably trying to process through their prey species worldview and failing spectacularly. "Not to other predators," he repeated quietly, the understanding hitting him like a bolt of lightning. The cubs weren't afraid of him because they recognized something in him that his classmates couldn't see. Something that had nothing to do with academy classifications or threat assessments, and everything to do with the fundamental recognition that occurred between apex species. He wasn't just a human studying alien wildlife. He was a predator communicating with other predators' offspring. And that, Jake realized as the first low howls echoed across the meadow from the nearby forest, was when things were about to get really interesting. The howls were unlike anything Jake had heard before, deeper than earth wolves, with harmonic undertones that seemed to resonate through the ground itself. They carried across the meadow with the kind of primal authority that spoke to something buried deep in every mammalian brain, predator and prey alike. The sound was beautiful, haunting, and absolutely unmistakable in its meaning. Someone was looking for their children. The cubs' reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. Their playful demeanor shifted instantly to excited anticipation, and they began making answering calls, higher-pitched versions of their parents' vocalizations that clearly meant, "We're here! We're here! Come find us!" Jake's classmates, predictably, had an entirely different interpretation of events. "Incoming hostiles!" someone shouted into the comm, with the kind of panic usually reserved for announcing incoming asteroid strikes. "Multiple large predators approaching from bearing 095. "All units, combat ready," Vexqui commanded, their voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who had clearly drilled for exactly this scenario. "Prepare defensive perimeter. Authorization granted for lethal force if threatened." Jake felt his stomach drop as the distinctive sound of Academy weapons powering up filled the air around him. Energy rifles hummed to life. Portable shield generators activated with characteristic buzzing sounds, and someone actually deployed what looked like a military-grade plasma cannon. "Wait!" Jake called into his comm, trying to project calm authority, while 6 excited cubs tumbled around his feet like furry golden torpedoes. "Nobody shoot anything. These are just parents looking for their kids." "Negative, Lieutenant," came Flux Dem's voice from orbit, tight, with bureaucratic panic. "Academy protocol clearly states that adult predator encounters require immediate defensive action. You are to withdraw from the cubs immediately and return to defensive positions." "That's exactly the wrong thing to do," Jake replied, scooping up one of the cubs that had been trying to climb his leg like a tree. The little creature settled into his arms with the kind of trust that only came from beings who had never learned to fear anything. "If I leave them now, their parents will think I was threatening them. If I stay calm and keep the cubs safe, this whole situation resolves itself peacefully." "You don't understand." Kuliksnav's voice crackled through the comm, crystalline vocal cords tight with terror. "Adult predators with cubs are the most dangerous creatures in the known galaxy. They'll attack anything they perceive as a threat to their offspring." Jake looked down at the cub in his arms, which had decided that his collar was the most interesting thing in the universe, and was investigating it with the kind of thorough attention that puppies brought to new discoveries. Another cub had managed to untie his bootlaces and was treating the dangling strings like the greatest toys ever invented. "I'm not a threat to their offspring," Jake said quietly. "I'm helping their offspring." The howls were getting closer, and with them came the sound of something large moving through the forest, with the kind of controlled power that spoke of creatures who had never needed to worry about stealth, because nothing in their right mind would challenge them anyway. "Mitchell!" Vexqui's voice carried a note of genuine desperation now. "Adult pack predators are not like the domesticated animals from your world. They are apex killers with no natural enemies. They will not hesitate to eliminate any perceived threat to their cubs." "Commander," Jake said, still speaking in the calm, quiet tones he would use around nervous animals, "what makes you think I'm not an apex killer with no natural enemies?" The words hung in the comm channel like a challenge to the fundamental assumptions every being on the team had made about the nature of threat and safety. Because that was the thing Jake was beginning to understand about humanity's place in the galactic community. His classmates saw him as Lieutenant Jake Mitchell, friendly exchange student who happened to be from a predator species. They had intellectualized his nature, categorized it, filed it away in the appropriate mental folders. But those approaching parents weren't going to see academy classifications or diplomatic protocols. They were going to see exactly what evolution had designed them to recognize: another apex predator in close proximity to their cubs. The question was whether they would interpret that as a threat to be eliminated or a fellow predator to be respected. Jake was about to find out which interpretation his body language, scent, and behavior communicated in the universal language that all predators understood. The trees at the edge of the meadow rustled, and Jake caught his first glimpse of what was approaching. Golden fur, massive shoulders, eyes that gleamed with intelligence and protective instinct. The adult predators were indeed significantly larger than house cats. They were roughly the size of earth bears, but with the elegant, purposeful movement of wolves. Beautiful, powerful, and completely focused on the scent of their missing cubs. "Oh," Jake breathed, understanding finally dawning. "Now I get why you're all so scared." But he didn't move. He didn't retreat to the defensive perimeter. He didn't activate his emergency beacon or call for extraction. Instead, he sat down cross-legged in the meadow, cradling one cub while the others played around him, and waited for their parents to arrive. Because running away now would be the surest way to convince those approaching predators that he was prey to be hunted rather than an equal to be respected. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Jake realized that his entire understanding of his species' role in the galaxy was about to be tested in the most direct way possible. Because if these were the cubs, the parents were probably on their way. And judging by the sound of those approaching howls, Mom and Dad were significantly larger than house cats. The adult predators emerged from the forest like living embodiments of every prey species' worst nightmare. 3 of them, moving with the fluid coordination of a pack that had hunted together for years. Each stood nearly 2 meters at the shoulder, with powerful hindquarters and intelligent golden eyes that swept the meadow with the kind of systematic precision that spoke of apex predators evaluating a potentially dangerous situation. Jake's comm system erupted into barely controlled chaos. "Contact! 3 large hostiles approaching from the tree line. Estimated mass, 800 kilos each. Weapons free! Weapons free! Mitchell, get away from those cubs now!" Jake remained perfectly still. One cub still nestled in his arms, while the others tumbled around his feet in excited anticipation. Every instinct honed by a lifetime of watching nature documentaries and hiking through actual wilderness told him that movement now would be catastrophic. Not because he feared for his own safety, but because sudden motion would transform him from a calm presence near their cubs into something that might be fleeing, and therefore prey. The lead predator, clearly the alpha of the pack, approached with the kind of measured caution that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with parental assessment. Its massive head lowered as it scented the air, processing information that Jake's human nose couldn't even detect. The cub in his arms began making soft, excited noises that were clearly some variation of, "Mom! Dad! Look what I found!" "Easy," Jake murmured, speaking as much to himself as to the cubs. "Everyone stay calm!" The alpha stopped approximately 10 meters away, close enough that Jake could see the intelligence in its eyes, the careful evaluation of this strange creature that smelled like predator but looked like nothing in their evolutionary experience. The other 2 adults flanked their leader, forming a loose semicircle that could become a coordinated attack formation in seconds, but currently served as a cautious approach pattern. Jake knew, with the kind of absolute certainty that came from genetic memory stretching back millions of years, that he was being judged according to criteria his academy training had never covered. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Vexaqui's voice crackled through the comm with barely controlled tension, "you have approximately 30 seconds before those creatures decide whether you're a threat to their offspring. If you're going to retreat, it has to be now." "I'm not retreating," Jake replied quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm that came from understanding exactly what was happening. "And they're not going to attack." "How can you possibly know that?" Jake looked directly into the alpha's eyes, not as a challenge, but as the kind of respectful acknowledgement that one apex predator gives another. "Because I'm not acting like prey." The alpha tilted its massive head, studying Jake with an expression that was startlingly familiar. He had seen that same look in the eyes of wolves at wildlife preserves, in the measured gaze of big cats at conservation centers, in the careful assessment of any predator encountering something unexpected but potentially significant. Recognition. Not the kind of recognition that came from having met before, but the deeper acknowledgement that occurred when two apex species encountered each other and realized they were operating according to the same fundamental rules. Jake slowly extended his free hand toward the Alpha, palm down, in the universal gesture of non-threatening contact. The movement was deliberate, controlled, and completely without fear. Because fear, he now understood, would be the one thing that could transform this encounter from communication to conflict. The Alpha approached another step, lowering its head to investigate Jake's scent more thoroughly. This close, Jake could see the powerful muscles beneath the golden fur, could hear the controlled breathing of a creature that could probably bite through battleship armor without significant effort. "Oh, my various gods," someone whispered over the comm channel. "It's going to kill him." But Jake knew better. The Alpha's body language was curious, not aggressive. Its ears were forward in interest, not flattened in preparation for attack. Its tail was neutral, not raised in dominance or lowered in submission. This was the posture of a predator investigating something intriguing, not preparing to eliminate a threat. The massive creature sniffed Jake's extended hand, processing information through senses that evolution had refined over millions of years. Then, in a gesture that probably stopped the hearts of 23 Academy cadets simultaneously, the Alpha licked Jake's glove with a tongue roughly the size of a dinner plate. The cubs immediately interpreted this as permission to celebrate. They began calling to their parents in excited chittering sounds while tumbling over each other in the universal language of young mammals who had successfully brought home something interesting for the adults to examine. "Well," Jake said quietly into his comm, "I think we just passed the initial screening." The other two adults approached now, apparently satisfied that their pack leader had determined Jake was neither threat nor prey. One of them, smaller than the Alpha but with the same intelligent eyes, began gently herding the cubs with the kind of patient efficiency that spoke of considerable parenting experience. "This is impossible." Fluxstem's voice crackled from orbit, carrying the tone of someone whose fundamental understanding of the universe was undergoing rapid revision. Predator species don't form peaceful contact with unknown entities. Their territorial instincts should be triggering aggressive responses. "They are," Jake replied, watching the Alpha continue its careful evaluation of his scent and body language. "But I'm not an unknown entity. I'm a recognizable entity." "What do you mean?" Jake considered how to explain something that he was only beginning to understand himself. "I mean, these guys recognize me as another apex predator. Not prey, not threat, just another species that evolved the same way they did. We're having a diplomatic meeting." The Alpha seemed to reach some kind of decision. It stepped back slightly and made a sound that was clearly directed at Jake. Not aggressive, not submissive, but the kind of vocalization that one adult might use to acknowledge another adult in a social context. Jake, operating on instincts he hadn't known he possessed, made a similar sound back. It wasn't a perfect imitation. His human vocal cords weren't designed for the full range of frequencies these creatures used, but it apparently conveyed the right general meaning. The effect on his watching classmates was immediate and profound. Did he just communicate with them? Klixinav's voice carried a mixture of awe and existential crisis that Jake was beginning to recognize as his roommate's default response to having his worldview challenged. "It appears," Vexqui said slowly, "that Lieutenant Mitchell has established some form of peaceful contact with adult apex predators." "While surrounded by their cubs," someone added, as if this detail made the accomplishment even more impossible. Jake stood up slowly, still cradling one of the cubs while the others played around his feet. The adult predators watched his movement with interest, but no alarm, apparently satisfied that he posed no threat to their offspring. The cubs got separated from the pack, Jake explained to his comm channel, addressing the pack leaders as much as his classmates. They're fine, just a little lost. I think if we give them some space, the family can head home and we can continue our exercise without any problems. The alpha made another sound, this one clearly directed at the cubs, who immediately began gathering themselves with the reluctant efficiency of children who had been told it was time to leave the playground. One of them tried to climb Jake's leg again, apparently not ready to end their encounter, but was gently retrieved by one of the adults. How is this possible? Fluxdem's voice carried the bewilderment of someone watching footage that contradicted every assumption in the Academy's training manual. Jake looked directly at the alpha, meeting its gaze with the kind of respectful acknowledgement that passed between equals. Because sometimes predators recognize other predators. The pack began to withdraw, the adults efficiently organizing their cubs for the journey back to wherever they called home. But the alpha paused at the edge of the forest, looking back at Jake with an expression that conveyed something that might have been approval, or respect, or simply acknowledgement that they had encountered something worthy of remembering. As the family disappeared into the forest, Jake turned back toward his classmates' defensive positions, where 23 beings were slowly emerging from behind their barricades with the kind of shell-shocked expressions usually associated with surviving natural disasters. "Mission accomplished," Jake said into his comm, unable to keep the satisfaction out of his voice. No casualties, no diplomatic incidents, and one happy family reunion. Vexqui approached him slowly, all 6 arms moving in what Jake had learned was their species' equivalent of profound confusion. "Lieutenant Mitchell," they said carefully, "what exactly just happened here?" Jake looked back toward the forest where the pack had disappeared, then at his classmates who were still processing what they had witnessed. "I think," he said slowly, "I just figured out why the Academy really wanted a human in their program. Because sometimes, when you encountered apex predators in the wild, the best solution wasn't bigger weapons or better defenses. Sometimes the best solution was another apex predator who spoke the same language.